I'm standing here on the Roger Street Bridge. Up until 1967, this was a dividing line between the communities of Alberni in that direction and Port Alberni, which would be behind me. It was a pretty, these two communities had their own personalities and they worked fairly well together. But of course there were a few rivalries, and some of those rivalries insinuated low moral character.
I think Arthur Waterhouse has been in cahoots with the land company and the CPR, and they've pulled strings down in Victoria to make this happen. I represent my constituents in Old Alberni, and we see this as an injustice. Mayor Waterhouse, so-called, in the new city of Port Alberni, I mean, that was a new community. It was only established in 1909. My community of Alberni has been there since 1886. That's 20-odd years of seniority. And yet they get made into a city first.
I would rather take the high road and not make personal remarks. We asked them in Victoria for incorporation, and they gave it to us. There was no complicity between us. There was no skullduggery.
I've been doing a little bit of research on the amalgamation of our twin cities, and today Jamie Martin was able to take a few minutes out of his day to help answer a few questions I had. Hi Jamie, good to see you again. Just out of interest on the twin cities, we had two cities geographically very close to each other. Why two cities so close?
Well, it goes right back to the beginning, actually. It was the Anderson Land Company. Anderson and Company, of course, was the one that was a partner in the initial stamp sawmill venture. They acquired legally in 1871 Lot 1 that comprises most of what is now the city of Port Alberni and Alberni originally. So they had this whole chunk of property, and in the 1880s they started looking at subdividing it. People were starting to move here as a result of the railway being built across the country. There was a wave of immigration from the east and from the US and from Britain coming out to the area. And basically they subdivided, laid out a town site in what is now North Alberni or Old Alberni. That was in the 1880s. So there was a little commercial district, there were lots laid out, there were services provided and so forth, later on mostly by private providers. They also had the area that is to the south of town, what is now the town of Port Alberni, and that was the area where they cut a deal with the CPR. Shortly after the CPR acquired the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway in 1907, they looked at developing a line that went to the tidewater in Port Alberni to be able to ship forest products and mineral products and so forth and so on back and forth, tying in with the CP navigation shipping system with the new train system that was being developed. So this is when the rail was put in initially. At the same time, 1910, they surveyed and laid out their great new town site of New Alberni or Port Alberni. So you've actually got the Anderson Land Company, later the Alberni Land Company, setting up these two town sites for different reasons at different points in time, about 20, 30 years apart.
So it's predominantly a company situation that produced the towns. Business.
Speculation situation. You have the immigrants that were coming in looking to get land. Initially what drove the Alberni settlement was farming. So after land could be alienated in the 1870s, people would get chunks of land, a preemption, typically 160 acres. However, they needed some kind of service center, and that's where the town site of Alberni comes in. It became the service center for the farmers and the agricultural activities that were going in the Beaver Creek, Cherry Creek, out towards Sprout Lake areas. So that was where that initial development came in the 1880s, 1890s. So not so much company, other than the Anderson Land Company deciding they could get a piece of this by subdividing and selling off their property in the town.
And I'm sure when you have two communities this close together, there's a lot of cooperation and also a lot of competition between the two, and maybe even sometimes a little animosity.
Oh, a certain amount. I think people recognize very much which of the towns they came from. And again, remember the one to the north was the farming town, the agricultural town. The one to the south was the industrial, sawmilling, railwaying, logging, shipping town, fishing. So it is kind of a different economic base. It attracted different groups of people with different attitudes. And yeah, you're right. When they started looking at forming up into cities, and getting their charters and so forth, they did look at that time at amalgamation. Right at the beginning, the 1911-1913 period, they were looking at this, but there were those differences that you mentioned. So they didn't see things quite eye to eye. And their interests were different. Their affiliations with the CPR, with the other companies, was different. And that did change things a little bit.
Our story starts on the 12th of March, 1912, only 2 months after the incorporation of Port Alberni as a city. W.J. Kerr is going to plant a small signpost marking the bottom of Johnson as the beginning of the yet-to-be-built Trans-Canada Highway. This is a big event with 83 motor cars bringing in 400 people to see the event. The Alberni Brass Band is playing, and there are a number of dignitaries, including the mayor and former mayor of Nanaimo and the mayor of Victoria, all coming to visit and make speeches. J.F. Bledsoe, who is chairman of this event, finally adjourns it. But then he warned the people of Port Alberni not to lay envious eyes upon this symbol. There will be a bulldog chained to it to protect it. Bledsoe's words were a warning. They certainly weren't heeded. And if they were a challenge, they were certainly accepted. By morning of the next day, the signpost had a new home. The Mile Zero signpost ends up down here on the corner of Kingsway and Argyle. It sits here for approximately 2 hours before anyone actually notices. But of course, by the time Mayor Waterhouse finds out, he gets a team and a crew to get out, pick it up, and send it back to where it came from. Mayor Waterhouse has considered this incident closed. But to his surprise, 5 days later, the chief constable of Alberni shows up with summonses, ready to arrest the mayor and the aldermen. Cooler heads prevail, and the whole thing is dropped. But yet, this is a story that once again still goes on. It's now picked up by the Victoria Times, the Victoria Colonist, the Vancouver Times, and a few other papers. Everybody wants to see what happens between the two communities. This is one of those stories that kind of kept going on. Nobody ever really knew who took the signpost, whether it was just some vandals having fun, maybe somebody who is not so happy that this was overshadowing the ceremonies of Port Alberni's incorporation. That we'll never know, but it is an interesting part of our history. After being twin cities for such a long time, why did they decide for amalgamation? What led to that?
Well, as I mentioned, they'd been talking about it for a long time, right from the beginning pretty much, because they were nearly physically adjacent. A lot of the people that lived in one town were working in the other. What drove it as much as anything was economics. And there were a couple of factors that really tied into this. You were asking about company towns before, and Port Alberni did turn into a company town. It turned into that, took on that status in a major way in 1952 when Macmillan Bloedel was formed. Macmillan Bloedel was the company that controlled most of the businesses, most of the industry in Port Alberni. Port Alberni was doing very well economically as a result of this. So in fairly quick sequence, they had the Somas sawmill built in '34, they had the plywood plant, then the pulp and paper plant going in, all controlled again by Macmillan Bloedel. This employed most of the people in the community along with the logging camps and so forth that were in outlying areas. Port Alberni was doing really well. And typically in the pre-war period, the population of Port Alberni was about double that of Alberni. In the post-war period, it continued to grow much more quickly. So by the 1950s, 1960s, Port Alberni was almost 3 times the population that Alberni was. It also had potentially a much better tax base coming in. The Mac Blow had done a sort of sharp deal with the city fathers and had something called a fixed assessment in place when they built the pulp mill in 1945. It was valued at $800,000 at that time, and the city committed to fixing, locking that tax rate in on an $800,000 facility to 1965 for 20 years. By the 1960s, the plant was worth $25 or $30 million, but they were still paying on an $800,000 assessed value. Everybody knew in '65 there was going to be this windfall of money coming into Port Alberni. So really, everybody wanted to get a piece of that. For Alberni, it wasn't doing as well economically. Because it was agriculturally based, that kind of faded away a little bit. A lot of the people in Alberni worked for the company, worked for Mac Blow in Port Alberni. They got all the smoke and stink and everything from the pulp mill, but they didn't get the tax benefits and so forth. So there was a big push from Alberni to consolidate, amalgamate, not so much from Port Alberni. What kind of changed things that way? So Fred Bishop was the longtime mayor of Alberni. He was a second-generation mayor, actually, and he was somebody who wanted to consolidate, wanted to join the communities together into one bigger city. On the other hand, you had a guy called Lauren Jordan, was the longtime mayor of Port Alberni. He had no interest in amalgamation because his city was doing really well. There was lots of money. There was potentially this great tax base coming. He eventually decided not to run in the 1963 election, and another man, Les Hammer, who had been the postmaster, I believe, in Port Alberni, ran for office, won, and he was all pro-amalgamation. So now you've got 2 mayors that want to join together. A lot of services had already been joined together. There was one school district for the region, for example, from 1946 on. The dump, the landfill was working as one unit. The SPCA was working as one unit. More and more of the infrastructure was working together. And eventually in 1964, with the 2 mayors that were in place then, and immediately following on the tsunami events, the tsunami and the recovery from that drew the communities together economically and sort of functionally. All of a sudden, you've got a referendum being presented to the people of Alberni and Port Alberni. It had to be a massive majority, over 60 or 65%, I believe, to make it work. Not surprisingly, Alberni voted, I think, 93.6% for amalgamation. People in Port Alberni not quite as enthusiastic, so it was 72.5%. But basically, that met the threshold. So tsunami was one of the triggers, but it was sort of the behind-the-scenes politics, too. You also had the province pushing for amalgamation. It would have been easier for them administratively. You have the feds, to a limited extent, pushing for it. So it all comes together nicely in '64 with the tsunami, just after the tsunami. September of '64 is when the referendum was held. And again, fairly overwhelming support for amalgamation.
the idea of amalgamation was popular. But no matter how popular the idea was, each community was able to keep its own identity.
We were true Alberni kids. We were brought up in Buford Street, right next to Alberni Elementary School. And so sports was a big thing. Alberni athletics was a big thing in our life. Athletic hall, everything to do with Alberni. I played on the softball team for Alberni Elementary School. Our thing in life was to beat Port Alberni, to beat 8th Avenue School. And my time in Alberni Elementary, we finally did it. One year I was Athlete of the Year in Alberni Elementary School, and I remember when I went to the high school in grade 7, I ran for the student council. So the guy who was sponsoring me, he said, and Ken McRae was the Athlete of the Year in Alberni Elementary. All the guys from Port Alberni stood up and booed. So that was my first kick at politics.
There used to be animosities between the two cities, but it was always a friendly kind of rivalry. It wasn't dangerous, it wasn't awful, it was just this nice little rivalry that made it better. And there's still the difference between do you live in Northport or do you live in Southport. It's still there to a certain extent, but we like each other.
And a lot of people in them days thought it shouldn't be called Port Alberni, it should be called Alberni, since we were the first city. And so that was a bit of animosity too.
Even though there were mixed feelings about amalgamation, it did help put our community on the map.
When Port Alberni and Alberni amalgamated, it was the largest city north of the Malahat. It was the third largest city on Vancouver Island at the time. So yeah, on balance, it has worked out really, really well.
Well, we had really great leaders at the time with Fred Bishop and, you know, other people like Jimmy Sawyer and all them guys. It came together, and I think it's the best thing that ever happened to us.
There's so many incredible things going on in Port Alberni right now, and you know, we have a great future. Lots of things on the horizon, big changes coming to our community in the years ahead. So yes, it is truly a pleasure and a privilege to be mayor of the city of Port Alberni.
And this year, lots of plans for the celebration of the 50th anniversary of amalgamation.
Because there's two major things happen in 2017. One, of course, is Canada's 150th birthday, and the other one that's incredibly important to us as a city is the amalgamation of Port Alberni and Alberni.
I'm sure that since the amalgamation, there's still a legacy of the Twin Cities. I'm sure I know some of the streets here in Port Alberni are different from those in Alberni, things such as that. What else might there be?
Well, that's one of the key things, because there were two totally separate infrastructures. The water systems were one of the things. That was sort of a hot button topic at the time, was trying to consolidate the water systems and getting utilities to all work together. The street system, as you mentioned, all that needed to be handled as part of this. The one that's kind of funny, given recent talk about it, is the 10th Avenue crossing. And that came up as part of this whole discussion in the 1960s. And in fact, that was one of the things that was being promised or suggested strongly at the time of amalgamation. Obviously, it never happened in the end. So we still don't have that second crossing that so many people have called for so many years. Whether we need it or not is another question I'll leave up to other people. The legacy of the amalgamation is largely in the built environment, and we're sitting in part of that right now in the Alberni Valley Museum, which is a later addition to Echo 67 Center. One of the things that was specifically done as part of this. And it's kind of a neat story too, how this all came to happen. In 1959, the city of Port Alberni had built its great new city hall, you know, sort of modern brutalist architecture. When they started developing and looking at amalgamation in '64, they started planning for that 3 years down the line. Well, what are we going to do? It's going to be the centennial of Canada, too. It's a big, big year in 1967. We need to really recognize that we're doing our amalgamation in the same year. So what did they do? They held a series of referenda again to find out what the people wanted to do. And they presented, I think they had 9 different projects initially for infrastructure development, building development. The first one went to the people in June of 1965. And this was sort of a consolidated referendum for a whole bunch of projects. This included the swimming pool, it included a fire hall, it included the 10th Avenue crossing, I believe. It included a works yard, it included a police station, public safety building. and it got turned down out of hand. They needed to gain a majority in that. This was one of the first times, and this is before the amalgamation, remember, but you got the people of Port Alberni and the people of Alberni voting together to say whether they want these new buildings and these new facilities constructed. So it gets blown out. They go back to the people in September of the same year, 1965, and they cut it back a little bit, and they set it up as 3 separate initiatives. One is for the public works buildings, so the police station, the fire station, public works, and some of the infrastructure road development. That one passed. They got through. The second one was for the swimming pool, got rejected. The third one was for a seniors center, and it got rejected too. So what did they do? They go back to the people yet again in June of 1966 with a sort of consolidated swimming pool and community center. It's no longer a senior center. It's the Echo Community Center, not called that yet. That was part of a contest. And it went through, but you know, it squeaked through by about 20 votes. So it was only about 20 people that swung the thing that resulted in us getting the great pool and everything. All this was constructed in time for the events. The actual amalgamation was October 28th, 1967, and the pool was in place by that. They had synchronized swimming and all kinds of special events around that. They opened the public safety building, the new police station at that time. The fire hall on 10th that we still have, it's barely changed at all from when it was constructed, 467. And then the public works yard, the buildings that are down by the Shaw facility actually were all constructed as part of this. Not the 10th Avenue crossing, however. So a big outcome out of it. All kinds of celebrations and events. They had Premier W.A.C. Bennett come up and lots of other dignitaries. Apparently it was an incredibly long 3 or 4 hour event at ADSS where they were sort of, all the local dignitaries were talking about how great amalgamation was. Then Bennett got up and made quite a quick speech, just said, yes, this is all swell. And a bunch of kids set off firecrackers in the back apparently while he was doing his speech. Lots of fireworks and so forth. A big, big deal when this all happened. Again, remember Centennial as well as the amalgamation, and 3 years of planning for it all. Everybody really had a good time.
It sounded like it was quite a good time. Sounded like they had a lot of fun with it.
A big, big event.
There was a lot of work behind it.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yes. It's been 50 years since the amalgamation of the Twin Cities. In my humble opinion, I would say this amalgamation has been a great thing for our cities. This year, let's get out and celebrate. I'm Gerald LaBute, your local time traveler, and I'll see you next time, whenever in time that may be.